I am really excited to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Soong Ra. He is the Robert Boyd Munger Professor of Evangelism at Fuller Theological Seminary. He holds a THD from Duke Divinity School, an MDiv and a DMin from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and a THM from Harvard University. He has authored or co-authored many award-winning books, and he is an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. He's spoken widely on the topics of the witness of the church, cross-cultural ministry, and social justice on both the domestic and global level. He is also on AACC's board. So would you please welcome up Dr. Soong Ra.
A real pleasure to be here with you this morning. Drove down from Pasadena, where I teach at Fuller Seminary, and didn't realize that even at 7 a.m. in the morning, there's traffic in LA. What is wrong with you people? What are you doing at 7 a.m. on Saturday, driving and causing anyway. So thankful to be here. I wish I could stay for the duration of the gathering today. Very moved that there are so many who want to engage in this topic, and to hear the stories of those who feel the kind of the personal connection to engagement on this topic. Thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate that. My daughter, she is 22, and I remember her freshman year at Pepperdine. She came out here, and we were still living in Chicago at the time, and get this phone call in the middle of the night. I actually happened to be out here. I was speaking at Gateway Seminary and doing a series of lectures there, and I get this phone call from my daughter saying there's been a mass shooting. And some of you might remember, this would have been my daughter's freshman year. There was a mass shooting at a club nearby Pepperdine, and it was actually like a college night. It was like a no alcohol served, but like a line dancing gathering from all the schools in that area, Lutheran University, as well as Pepperdine, a number of other schools in that area. And I just remember, as parents, you might know what that feels like, to feel like your daughter's life is in danger. She wasn't at the club shooting. One of her suite mates was, and one of her classmates was killed at that shooting. And so that morning, I kind of rushed through my presentation and rushed over to be with my daughter right after that. And I remember there were all these words around campus, screens that said the word lament, and they were kind of having the entire day. There was a services of lament at the university, and just to you don't know. Some of you know what it feels like to be helpless as a parent, to see your 18-year-old. She had just turned 18 actually. You see your 18-year-old just kind of nervous and scared. And I actually remember before she went off to college having a conversation with her, and just kind of checking in, father to daughter. And I remember her saying that since I was like 8 years old, I don't ever remember feeling safe in a public setting. So for 10 years of her life, since she first became aware of these things, she said, I would go to, concerts with friends, and I would, be around in these kind of large public gatherings, even graduations, those kinds of gatherings, even sometimes church gatherings, sadly. And I would never feel safe, that this was not a safe world. And again, as a parent, to feel hopeless or helpless about that is, as many of you might empathize, that's a brutal, brutal thing for a parent to feel. And so I've kind of been thinking through this for many decades now about how does the church respond to these kinds of questions and issues in our society. And so I want us to walk through some of the basic foundational issues of how to do an theological, or biblical theological ethics on how to better respond as a church community or as Christians to the reality of our broken world. And I want to introduce you to two different paradigms. The first is offered by my former mentor at Gordon Conwell, Eldon Villafañe, Latino theologian, ethicist, and he talks about how to do ethical studies, or study of ethics, and practical theology well. And he says that there are three categories that you have to engage, and if you leave out one versus the other, then it's not really practical or applied theology. It's just kind of a theology in your mind that never gets to what people are doing in actual real life. So Villafañe offers these three categories. He said, you must do all three: clarification, conceptualization, and confrontation. And those three categories, I'll explain them quickly. Clarification is to know the context into which your theology and your ministry is occurring. And this seems pretty straightforward. Any of you who've done evangelism or mission work, you know that you can't walk into a new setting without understanding something about that setting. It's like going to another country and just trying to speak English with no translator. You have to understand that a different language is being spoken there. Not just languages, but also different cultures. And that there are even certain symbols and certain signals that you give off that are communicating something, even if you're not saying anything. So clarification is just a very basic missiological step to say, if I'm going to do ministry in this particular part of the country or part of the world, I need to better understand what's going on in that community. And so there are certain things that you could actually talk about that could mean one thing in one place and mean something else in another place. So it's a very basic, again, missiological, even evangelistic concept of how do you understand the world that you are speaking into. The second category is conceptualization, the key word there being concepts. And here we're talking about theology. What are the biblical passages, the scriptures, scriptural references that gives us the theological, biblical concepts, the content that we want to speak into our context? So we're not negating the reality of how important Scripture is to our communities, and how Scripture and the Bible and our theology informs the way we think, so that content is able to be communicated. But again, it needs to be spoken into a particular context in a way that is understandable by that context. And of course, the third category is confrontation. Now, there had to be 3 C's because this is for church usage, so you have to have alliteration and 3 points. But the word confrontation might seem a little bit, kind of scary, but it just means do something about this. Do something. So it's not about confronting and fighting. It just means don't just think about it. Don't just reflect on the community, but actually do something within that community. So that third category is where we would talk about applied theology or methods or practices, the things that we will actually do in order for our theological content to speak into our social context. So just a couple of things I want to point out here is that, one, I am not asking you to change your theology necessarily, because most of us already have a pretty good foundational theology. It's more that sometimes we don't know how that theology speaks to our context, and also how our theology leads to action. We just have good theological ideas. So I'll give you an example. I went to Gordon Conwell, which is a Reformed seminary, and in Reformed theology, there are some pretty clear theological foundations. Some would say it's defined by TULIP. Yeah, the 5 letters of TULIP. Well, there are a lot of different ways to look at this. But one of the central themes in Reformed theology is human depravity. All have sinned and continue to fall short of the glory of God. There's a brokenness in our world. There's a brokenness in our system. There's just a brokenness. It's the result of sin. Now, if I'm going to go to that community to speak on things like theological ethics or social justice, I don't need to change their theology. I just need to go deeper with that theology. Because I'm going to agree, yeah, there is a major problem of sin and brokenness in our world. There is a total depravity. But that total depravity is found on multiple levels of our society. You might be talking about the total depravity of individuals, which I would not disagree with. But let's go deeper with that doctrine and recognize that total depravity is actually total depravity. Not just an individual that has fallen and fallen short of the glory of God, but also the systems and structures and how society is broken. And therefore, if we go deeper with our theology, then does not our confrontational strategy change? If we're saying that Our theology, if we go deeper with this idea of total depravity, and we're understanding that from an individual lens and from the social structural lens, then how we change that or confront that is also going to change. So let me build on this a little bit more to talk about how we do the clarification process and what the theological response becomes. And this is the work of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. Peter Berger was a sociologist at Boston University. Just an interesting side note. I studied at Harvard University with my mentor there was Harvey Cox and Cornel West. And Harvey Cox, some of you might recognize the name, was a very famous Protestant liberal theologian and taught at Harvard for like 60 years. I don't know if he's still alive. I lost track of it. If he is, he's like 95 years old. So Harvey's been around for many, many years. And at a certain time in Harvard's history, his ideas were really shaping, in the 60s and 70s, a pretty significant theological movement. And it was named the God is Dead movement. And the idea there was that society had advanced so much and that we had come of age and we had done good things and built great cities and built great societies, that society didn't need God anymore. So that was the idea, the God is Dead movement. And this is happening in Cambridge at Harvard Divinity School. And there happens to be a person on the other side of the river at Boston University. And his name is Peter Berger, the person who wrote this up. And Peter Berger is not a theologian, but he's a sociologist. And he's trying to figure out a way to respond to what is happening on the other side of the river at Harvard, which is God is dead, we don't need God anymore, society is in a good place, why do we need God? And so Berger starts writing about why we need God. Again, he's doing it not as a Christian theologian, but as more of a sociologist. And so his writings on the sacred canopy, the social construction of reality, he begins to talk about there is such a brokenness in our world that's why we need God. And so this is interesting how his analysis is a Christian response to a particular way of thinking, which is we don't need God. And Berger points out, by actually recognizing the brokenness in the world, it points towards how much we need God. So I've always found it to be fascinating that here were these two academics kind of presenting from different disciplines, but actually the sociologist had it more accurate than the theologian actually had it. So let's talk about these three categories that Peter Berger offers: externalization, institutionalization, and internalization, and how each of these levels of what forms society, and in the end social evil, or sinful society, that each of these levels has a positive entry point and also a potential negative entry point. So all three factors are at play when you talk about the development of social sin or societal problems. The first category is externalization. And that idea is simply that the individual shapes and forms society. And this is pretty basic. You walk into a gathering like this, we come as individuals, and each of us during the course of the day will externalize who we are into this system. We will externalize our values, we will externalize our ideas, we will externalize all the things that we've learned over the years, and by externalizing them, you help shape the system. The illustration that I use oftentimes, I was a church planner, helped plant 4 different churches. And the church that I helped to start in Cambridge, before we started the church, I got together with a small group, 6 or 7 individuals. I'd been a campus minister, so we had some MIT students. I knew people in the area. We had some Harvard alumni. We had a number of young people gathering together back in 1996. That's how old I am. Wow. Okay, so we were back in almost 30 years ago. We're gathering together in this small apartment in Boston to talk about what does a church plant look like. And each of us begins to externalize our individual values into that system. So one person says, I grew up in a church that was very much valued expository scriptural teaching. And let's have that in our church. So they're externalizing the value of expository scripture teaching. It becomes a part of the church. I grew up in a church that had contemporary worship, and I really feel that that's a great way to worship. Can we have that in our church? Externalization of an individual value. I grew up in a church that had nothing to do with the neighborhood and community, and I didn't like that. Is there a way we can engage our neighborhood more? And another individual, in a negative way this time, is externalizing one's value and experience into that social setting. So again, pretty straightforward. You see this in churches, denominations, and the focus here is that the individual contributes to a social group and the individual changes that group. So keep that in mind when we talk about externalization. How do you change a social system? Change the individual so that their values are getting externalized and that it's a healthy system that's being developed by healthy individuals. That's one category of social structures. The second category, though, is the category that says, but sometimes institutions and systems and structures take on a life of their own that outlive their founders, and that the individuals that form that system might be gone, but these systems go on. Now, some of you know the story. Fuller Seminary started way back in the day. I think we just celebrated our 75th anniversary. It started off as an extreme fundamentalist institution. The founders of Fuller were extreme fundamentalists. Now, those founders are long gone, and 75 years later, Fuller as an institution still exists. But if you compare the theological notes from fundamentalism to where Fuller is now as a neo-evangelical institution, they're very, very different. I mean, in 75 years ago, Fuller would have never dreamed of affirming women in ministry. And now, 75 years later, it's one of the most stalwart evangelical institutions that affirm women in ministry. Because even though the founders might leave, the institution takes on a life of its own and will continue to exhibit maybe different values or new values because of the power of that institution having a system and structure beyond the individuals that found it. I definitely saw this in my church when I was a church planter. We get together with these individuals, we start the church, and the church grows. And after a certain point, even me as the senior pastor realized this church has a life of its own beyond those who helped start the church in the first place. In fact, if you know anything about kind of the church planting statistics, within the first 7-10 years of a church plant, almost all of the founding members are gone. Right? You know that statistic, right? So if a group starts a church within this first 7-10 years, almost all of those founding members are gone. Why? Because church planters are totally ADHD, and there's kind of a natural, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? So that happens. The individuals that form the institution in the first place will often leave, but the institution has a life of its own, and a system and structure develops that outlives the individuals that formed in the first place. So now we've got two different ways of system formation and system confrontation. One is individualistic, the other is recognizing systems and structures. Here's one of the problems within, particularly in my area of study is U.S. evangelical Christianity, both historically but also in its current iteration. U.S. evangelicalism in particular only knows how to change right here. And when we talk about changing the world, our philosophy and approach is limited to this. Change individuals, and that would change the world. It goes back to some of our earlier literature. So D.L. Moody, one of the great evangelists within the evangelical world, what was one of his famous lines? The world is a wrecked vessel. This system is wrecked and it's messed up. So we're not going to change the system or rescue the system. We're just going to save individuals out of that system. So again, an individual focus. In one of my first books, I wrote about the hyper-individualistic tendency of American Christianity. And one of the ways I studied that was by looking at worship music. So I'm old. I'm so old that I remember the overhead projector. You remember the overhead projector? Okay, can I get an amen for the overhead projector? I remember the box that we would have filled with these transparencies. You all remember transparencies, right? And so they would have a folder because you wanted to make sure that you can pull out the songs at the right time. And the worship back in the day, like you didn't have to plan anything. You just say, hey, let's sing this song, and you pull out that right song. But what happened was, if you look at the transparency box, you'll have like 2 songs that begins with the letter A, Awesome God, Almighty God. 1 or 2 songs that begin with the letter B. But what was always the thickest folder in that transparency box? The letter I. In fact, you would have I part 1, I part 2, and I part 3. Because so many of our songs begin with the letter I, individualism. The focus is, how do you change the world? Change the individual, without recognizing that there are also social structural elements to how change and sin operates. So I'll give this illustration. Interesting history. My grandparents were Presbyterian in Korean Presbyterian. Surprise! So my grandparents are Korean Presbyterian, but they were actually part of the Pyongyang revivals in North Korea, which some of you may or may not know was one of the most significant revivals in the 20th century. It rivals the Great Awakening. It rivals the Welsh revivals. We just don't talk about it in American seminaries, but it's one of the most significant revivals. And the Pyongyang revivals led to the planting of churches in Seoul eventually, and then that led to the growth of the megachurches in Seoul. So that's a generation later. So my grandparents are Presbyterian, but my parents met at a Southern Baptist church, Seoul Baptist Church in Korea, and then when we moved to the U.S., we became Southern Baptists. After a while, the senior pastor of the Southern Baptist Church left, and brought in a new pastor, and he happened to be Baptist, but he was also Pentecostal. So our church, when I was growing up in youth group and in my years in college, we were a Baptist Pentecostal church. Can I get an amen? Any Baptist Pentecostal? Yeah, see, there's not many of us, but there are some of us who are Baptist and Pentecostal. That was my church, which meant we had the absolute best retreats. Like, you had the best of both worlds at youth retreats. So the first night, of course, we were good Southern Baptists. What did we do? We asked everybody to come down the aisle, receive Christ as their Savior. They got the book of John. We did a good Southern Baptist thing. Everybody got saved on that first night of the youth retreat. But what was the second night of the youth retreat? Exorcism, because that's what Pentecostals do. So we did the both and. We had the great personal salvation, and then we had the casting out of demons. So I remember, at these kind of retreats, and, we got all these people praying, and somebody discerns this 14-year-old boy has 4 demons of lust. And we all gather around, and we lay hands, and, Lord, we cast out 4 demons of lust. Now, many, many years later, having been parents of teenagers, I start wondering, does that 14-year-old really need 4 demons to be horny? The answer is no. If you've ever raised teenagers, you know 13, 14-year-olds need no demonic help whatsoever to be lustful. So I'm thinking, again, do not try this at home. I have 4 degrees in theology. I can do this. Do not try this at home. I play a game called If I Were Satan, What Would I Do? Again, do not try this at home. I can do this. I'm thinking, if I were Satan, what would I do? If I were Satan, and I had a limited number of demonic forces under my control, would I send 4 demons to a 14-year-old boy in Northern Virginia? Would that be the most effective use of my resources? No. What would you do? I would, if I were Satan, I would say, take those 4 demons, put them into the systems and structures of our society where they would never be detected, because we're all so caught up here. Put them into the system and structures of our society. Yeah, you can cause sexual immorality in one person, or you can build a system of sexual immorality. Yeah, you can create a violent person, individual, or you can create a culture of violence, a social system of violence. And you might have seen that movie, Usual Suspects, where Kevin Spacey has that great line. He goes, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled off is making us believe he doesn't exist." I would argue the second greatest trick the devil ever pulled off is making us believe he only is here and is not found in other spaces. And this is where I quote my former ethics professor, Stephen Mott, and he wrote, "We must confront evil in its proper geography." Yes, we confront sin in the individual. That is clearly a part of the calling of God. That is clearly what the church is called to do, confront sin in the individual. But if we are we that naive that we say, oh no, but sin doesn't exist in the system, sin doesn't exist in the structures, then how do you deal with Ephesians chapter 6, which talks about the powers and principalities that are embedded in the systems and structures? So the challenge for many Christians now, especially in the U.S., is that we are so hyper-individualistic, we don't have an understanding of how to confront sin, not only in the individual space, but also in the systemic structural space. We don't know how to do it, we don't have the theology for it, we don't have the social understanding of it, and therefore our confrontation is limited to this particular way of change. And so how do we begin to shift from a limited understanding of our theology to a theology that says we will confront evil in its individual expressions, of course. So yeah, if there is one bad guy with a gun, then we will look for ways to make sure that guy doesn't, something doesn't happen. We will give mental health care, and we will care for that person. But that's actually what happened at the church in the South, where a white man, a young boy actually, walks into a church with a small group prayer meeting with African Americans, and they loved that young man as an individual. You know the story, right? They accepted him into their group. They prayed for him. And he didn't shoot right away because that group of African American church members invited that young white man into their group and was actually caring for them. But then that individual change wasn't enough. That system and structure, and then I'm going to talk about the narratives, was so powerful that he did end up killing everybody in that room. So how do you not just change the individuals, but also change the systems and structures? But there's actually a third level that I begin to think more about that Berger and Luckman offer as well. And that's the third level of systemic formation, which is internalization. And what happens with internalization is that the system and structure has an influence in such a way that when new people come into the system, you begin to internalize the stories, the narratives, the imagination, the worldview, the value system of the system that you have now walked into. Again, you see this. I'll give the example from my church, and this is a positive example. At about the 7-year mark of the church, a new intern came to the church, and I said to the intern, one of the best ways to get to know the church is to visit as many small groups as you can. Go to about the next 2 months, visit all the small groups, and then come back to me and tell me what you learned, and tell me some things you observed about the small group, and tell me what that tells you about the culture of the church. He comes back and he says, it was fascinating. So, the church at the time was mostly young people, young adults, college students, etc., who were kind of just starting off in their careers. And he said, I've been in those contexts before with a lot of young people and young adults. And I remember going into one small group meeting, and they were talking about this person who just got a job. And because he just got a job, he was thinking about buying a new computer. And then the group began to process what that meant. And what he said was like, I've been in gatherings like that before, where young adults talk about purchasing and all that stuff. And they always say, especially when it comes to computers, buy the best, spend every dime that you have to buy the best computer. But he said this group was actually raising the question of, well, if you spend X amount of dollars, could you give X amount of dollars to the children's ministry? If you spend X amount of dollars and maybe less than that, would that help some of the homeless? So they were having these conversations because there was an internalization of the church's value in such a way that in small groups, which is where a lot of these things happen, they were having questions and raising issues that, again, my intern never had heard that in other churches, but actually grappling with these issues because the group had internalized a particular value system. This is very important because how do you deal with internalized narratives and imagination? So I want to give you an example of how I came to the possibility that this is where we might need the most change and how the church in particular might be the space that happens. And as I was looking at this system, how social reality is constructed and how all three work together, 3 legs to a stool, I was asking the question, when have there been major social changes and what has been the result of those major social changes? So the first issue that I thought about is slavery. If you were to think of the most evil system in human history, you could argue that, slavery, or at least in U.S. history, that slavery, the chattel slavery that we had in the U.S., is the most evil system that we've had in the U.S. So, and that was formed by these elements. There were individual elements to it, the individual slave owners, the president of the Confederacy, the generals that led the Confederacy. So there were individuals that helped shape that system, but there was also the institution of slavery. Now, when you begin to build that system, what you do is you need to confront that system. So there were individuals who came up against the system of slavery. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, even the generals on the side of the Union. You had all these individuals stand up against the unjust system, but we also needed systemic structural change to confront this broken system. So we did have a civil war. We did have a 13th Amendment, Juneteenth, all of these kind of federal laws and even kind of a systemic war to confront the system of slavery. And guess what? The system of slavery, as we knew it back then, no longer exists because there was a systemic confrontation to the system of slavery. But what happens? Even if the system and structure of slavery got torn down, very shortly thereafter, another system took its place. A different system that maybe not as evil or as harmful, but still very, very bad. And that's the system of Jim Crow. And so Jim Crow is able to do pretty much what the system of slavery was able to do. It disenfranchised African American voters. It created a two-tier caste system between white landowners and black sharecroppers. It created a structure or system under Jim Crow laws that was almost as bad as the system of slavery. So how did that happen? So you swapped out the individuals. You replaced Jefferson Davis with Abraham Lincoln. You had Ulysses S. Grant winning over Robert E. Lee. So you swapped out the individuals. You even tried to swap out the system. But what happened? You left a narrative behind, that third leg of the stool. And then when you left the narrative behind, the narrative reconstituted itself in a new system. Think of it this way. You've got an engine that is broken, and you want to fix the engine. But you realize you can't, so you throw the engine away, the engine of oppression of slavery, you throw it away and you cast it aside. But you kept the fuel that fueled that engine. So when you build a new engine, you're still using that negative fuel. And so you tear that system down, the system of Jim Crow, and you have a structural confrontation, an individual confrontation. You have Martin Luther King Jr., you have Malcolm X, you have LBJ, you have on these multiple levels, you're beginning to see confrontation against the evil system of Jim Crow. You have a civil rights movement, you have the Voting Rights Act, you have the Fair Housing Act, you have the Immigration and Nationality Act. Those are all parts of the civil rights movement that confronts the evil system and structure of Jim Crow. And yeah, we did. We stopped Jim Crow. But what emerged on the heels of Jim Crow? Well, a new Jim Crow. So that 20% of African American males in Florida have no right to vote. Why? Because you have mass incarceration. And once you have mass incarceration, you not only take their votes away for that moment, you take it away, for many cases, for a lifetime. So now you have created a new system. Now, is it as bad as Jim Crow, which was not as bad as slavery? No, but it is still doing the same things in almost in similar ways. So, for example, what is the most populous African-American voting district in the United States? What area has the highest percentage of African-Americans in one voting district? Washington, D.C. Anywhere from 80 to 85%, numbers shift, but about 80 to 85% of Washington, D.C. is African-American. So you have a population, significant population. In fact, D.C. is larger than, I think, Wyoming and Montana, like several states. They're larger than that. How much representation does Washington, D.C. have in the federal government? How many senators do they have? And how many congresspersons do they have? Zero. Zero. So we're talking about in mainland U.S., continental U.S., a region of a population whose numbers are larger than several states with zero representation. And why is that? Well, it's 80 to 85% African American. We have a disenfranchised community. So what about, though, the second most populous African American population in terms of voting district? State of Mississippi. Anywhere from 40 to 45% of Mississippi's African Americans. But out of their 6 federal representatives, 2 senators and 4 congresspersons, how many are African American? 1. 1 out of 6 representing 1 out of 2. Well, how do you do that? Voter suppression, gerrymandering, all the stuff you need to do to suppress and to minimize the African American vote. So you have created a system that works almost as well as the previous evil system because you never touched the fuel that fueled these systems in the first place. This, to me, is the leverage point of the church. Because the church, we operate in narratives, imagination, and values. Sometimes it is hard to say, okay, what do? We say, okay, well, if we just get the right president into office, and if that right president appoints the right Supreme Court justice, if we get the right state senator or the right representative, I'm not saying those things are wrong. I'm saying it's incomplete. I'm saying it's partial. So yeah, voting matters, and yeah, who you vote into office matters, but that's only part of the story because you're swapping out individuals, but you're not changing the system, and you're not even touching the narrative. In fact, you end up buying into a narrative that might be less Christian and more political. So what are we doing here? We're trying to, as Stephen Mott says, confront evil in its proper geography. So yeah, we can say, well, there's a lone gunman out there that, there's a lone gunman out there, and we need to make sure that that lone gunman doesn't externalize their evil values. Yeah, we can try that. You can try that with get the bad man with the gun by confronting him with a good man with a gun, right? You've heard that theory. But how has that worked so far? More mass shootings than days in the United States this year. So that's one strategy, but it is an incomplete strategy. It's a strategy that makes sense if you think the entire world only operates on a hyper-individualistic level, which, again, many churches think. So then we say, how do we change the systems and structures? How do we do this as a community? How do we actually organize? How do we actually talk about the ways that systems and structures can be changed? And yeah, that might be new laws or doing away with old laws. In the same way that the civil rights movement required a changing of the laws, which, by the way, almost every single person in this room benefited from, because the Immigration and Nationality Act was a result of the civil rights movement. And so we benefited when the systems and structures were challenged. Now, I also want to challenge, what does new narratives look like? A new imagination, a new way of thinking about how the world works. I'll give you two quick examples to wrap up and open up for Q&A. The first example is kind of a silly one, but I get a lot of pushback on this. So several years ago, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un was threatening with all these weapons. You all remember, like the nuclear weapons, and it was a big deal. I actually visited Korea not long after that, and I asked, it's small sample size, I know. They're like asking, so what's the threat of North Korea? And they're like, it's always been the same. Because if you go to South Korea and you go to the border, you can see North Koreans right across the river. It's about from here to there. It's not that far. So if North Korea wanted to bomb South Korea, they can just kind of hurl it and throw it, right? I mean, it's get a couple of people and just catapult nuclear weapons into South Korea. That's how close it is. They're right across the river, or there's a DMZ there. So when Kim Jong-un was actually launching rockets, right, what was the fear? Not that South Korea was going to be bombed. That could happen at any time. It's again, just throw them over the border. It was Japan. It was U.S. bases. That was more of the fear. It was possibly Hawaii, kind of actual U.S. territory. That was more of the fear. So I remember the conversation around this. And the conversation was, we got to make sure that North Korea doesn't get nuclear weapons or the projectiles to send nuclear weapons close to us. So I remember thinking about this. It's like, yeah, I agree. I do not want Kim Jong-un. I do not want someone to have nuclear weapons who doesn't know what he's doing. But think of it this way. You walk into this room, and there are 12 people at these two tables. And everybody has an AR-15 assault rifle. And there's one guy with a crazed look on his face, and he's trying to figure out how to work this thing. And it's falling apart in his hands, and he's trying to put the pieces together, and he doesn't know what he's doing. But he definitely has a crazed look. I don't want that guy with that AR-15. But I'm not as afraid of that guy as this other guy who not only has an AR-15, knows how to use it, and has actually used it on civilian lives before. In fact, there's only one nation that's done that. North Korea hasn't actually figured things out. The madman is still at the table trying to put the pieces together. But there is one nation that has actually used nuclear weapons against civilians at a catastrophic loss of life, and that's the United States. And I didn't hear around that time, maybe the U.S. shouldn't have nuclear weapons. Why? Because the U.S. is an exceptional Christian nation. And so that narrative begins to become a part of our vocabulary. Walter Wink calls this the myth of redemptive violence in American society. We believe as an American nation, we have the power to use violence, but it's redemptive. We are the arsenal of democracy. We are those who can use nuclear weapons to end a war, and that's okay. Or we are the ones who can go and police nations, and that's okay. Now, think of that on the geopolitical level, but think of that on the individual level. We are a nation that has the imagination that says everybody can and should have guns, and it's okay. Why? Because we are an exceptional nation. There's something special about us. We are better than everybody else. So if Japan has gun control, well, we're not Japan. If the UK has gun control, well, we're not UK. We're better than that. Are we? Why aren't we having these conversations about that imagination? And all of a sudden, that tulip thing isn't working. Because it's like, yeah, total depravity for African nations and Asian nations and European nations and Latin American nations, but total depravity doesn't work in the U.S. When actually the total depravity of individuals, the total depravity of societies, and yes, the depravity of narratives is all a part of our social reality. So how do we begin to change the narrative? That's the second illustration I want to talk about. Think of it this way. I grew up in the city. I know nothing about farms, and so I'm going to get this really bad. But you're out in the middle of nowhere in a farming community. There's a big hill. And at the top of the hill is this massive John Deere tractor trailer tire. Just a tire, nothing inside, a hollowed-out tire. And it's at the top of the hill, and your pet dog and or cat is at the bottom of the hill. And you're in the middle of the hill. And you see the tire start rolling down the hill, and you guys say, oh, I got to stop this thing. So your first instinct is you are the heroic individual, and you will externalize your Superman powers and step in front of that tire to stop that tire. And what happens to you? You're a pancake. You've been flattened by the momentum of that tire. He says, okay, I saw this in a lecture in a church one time. I'm going to address the system and structure. So I'm going to jump into the tire and try to slow down the tire from within. I'm going to be a part of the system and change the systems and structure. But then you get into the tire and you realize the system is much stronger than you thought. And you get caught up in that system. And now you've actually added more weight and velocity and momentum to that system. Versus, how do you change that narrative? How do you change the imagination behind that tire going downhill? How do you change the worldview, the way of thinking? And again, that's where the church comes in. Because that's what we do as a church. We change the imagination of a community that says you see yourself as a broken, fallen person with no hope, and Christ offers a hope, a new imagination that says you can be more than that broken, fallen person. You see the world as a broken, fallen place, but the church offers an imagination that says there's a different way of viewing how we relate to the world. That's our job as a church, to change the imagination, to internalize a different set of values. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions about the content we've had so far.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, a lot to think about. Okay, so as we did in the last two conferences, we're going to use Slido.com. I'm sorry I didn't mention this at the beginning. Can we go to the Slido slide? Okay, so Slido.com, that is our number 204-3963. Please submit your questions, and we will get right into it whenever we start getting the questions in.
Sorry.
And this will also be the Q&A where you can submit questions for after Ray's talk as well. Okay, so first question. In the story, how do you create change?
The story of the tire going downhill. Well, one thing is you can't beat a narrative with more of the same narrative. You create counter-narratives. So in some of the stuff that's been done at MIT, the Sloan Business School, it talks about if there is a system that has momentum in one direction, you need to create momentum in the opposite direction. And so that's what I mean by the imaginative change that churches can do. And this is where it gets to the theory of like practice, right? So what you practice in the church is possibly more important than what you actually say in the church, right? So if you, so I said, I was a pastor for many years, and I say to my students, not your first year of ministry, not your second year, but about your third year of ministry, this is what you do. After service is over, you go through the sanctuary and you pick out all the bulletins that have been left behind. And you go to the section where they're supposed to take notes on your sermon and actually see what they wrote. And what they've written has nothing to do with what you preached that day. Little flowers, a grocery list. That's more likely what it, so don't do this in your first year, it'll crush you, and you'll never be able to preach again. But the fact is that sometimes what we say from the pulpit is not necessarily landing in the right way or in the right space. So how do you begin to demonstrate and not just proclaim? And you see this in the Bible, by the way. You see this throughout the book of Mark, where Jesus proclaims the gospel about the kingdom, and then right after he demonstrates the kingdom. So how do you, through your church practices, begin to demonstrate this? So a couple of examples that I can think of is I wrote a book on lament. And I got a lot of feedback from pastors, well, how do we introduce this? And I said, probably the worst thing you can do is do one sermon on lament and be done with it. Yeah? And because then it's not a part of your system. It's just something you do intermittently, right? It's like Black History Month. Hey, Black History Month, coldest, shortest, most miserable month of the year is Black History Month. And then what do? People complain about having Black History Month and then ignore Black History for the 11 months of the year. So if you do lament as a practice, as an ongoing practice as a church. So, this is a pet peeve of mine. Why do churches insist on ending Good Friday on a happy note? That's the whole point of Good Friday. It's not a happy moment. Yes, you can celebrate 2 days from now, but the practice is that's a moment of lament, and so don't end up with, end the service with yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord. End the service with lament, because you need that practice of actually not having everything resolved all the time. I see this in urban ministry where pastors want to put good testimonies up. And they are good testimonies. I was on drugs 20 years ago. I was on the streets and I was dealing. And 10 years ago I got clean, and look at my life now. Those are good testimonies. But 95% of those who are addicted don't have that testimony. They have, I shot up last night. I'm still feeling it. And I'm actually, as soon as I leave, that's what I want to do. That's my testimony. See, there's a pretty significant difference there. Because in the former, you're talking about triumph and victory, and those who can't access that can't come closer to that. But in the second, you're talking about lament and suffering, and all of us know that in some way or another. So again, what are you practicing? What are the songs you're singing? What are the testimonies you're offering? I say this to pastors all the time. If I were to go through your sermon over a period of a month, and when you cite books or famous Christians, what percentage of that would be white male leaders? What books are you reading that you're constantly citing, and it's constantly white men? So what are you doing? Even though you haven't explicitly said, I prefer white male Christians over everybody else, that's what you've practiced. That's what you've demonstrated. So how do you begin to change that narrative? One of the ways we did it at our old church was both my daughter and my son were dedicated by African-American pastors. And so to say all along, oh, we believe in diversity, oh, we believe in cross-cultural ministry, oh, we believe in, learning from one another, but the visual of our child being held by African-American pastors, the passing off and saying, we trust you with our child, that was probably much more powerful than any sermon I might have given on racial reconciliation. So how do you demonstrate that, not just proclaim it?
Great, thank you. So there's some really good questions in here, y'all. I'm like reading them. I want answers to all these. I want them to answer all of them. So next question. How does the myth of redemptive violence play out in the teachings and practices of American churches?
Yeah, so, I think the whole whatchamacallit, the idea of like thoughts and prayers is a reflection of that, right? So thoughts and prayers are saying individuals can change the system by just being good individuals. And so there's an assumption, my mentor Willie Jennings talks about this, that there's an assumption of the self-sufficiency of the white male in our society. And that model of self-sufficiency is the model that we repeatedly refer to. And I see this in seminary. I've taught at many, many different seminaries. The ideal seminary student is a white male student. One, they pay full tuition. They get their churches and denominations pay full tuition. Ideal. Two, they've read all the books that they needed to read. They've read Jonathan Edwards and Martin Luther and John Calvin, so that's an ideal student. So if you get a student from Africa who doesn't have funding, then that again creates that problem. Well, this person isn't the ideal student. We'll accept him or her, but that's not the ideal student that we want in our seminary. So again, what are the narratives you have created, and what are the messages that you're sending indirectly even? And so around this idea of American exceptionalism, you'll see this come up in a lot of different ways, in a lot of more subtle ways than not. Do you have an American flag in your church? That is, I just kind of had to look around real quick. Sorry, but they don't. But I've seen so many churches with not just the American flag, but the so-called Christian flag, which is a ripoff of the American flag. Like the way it was designed, it looks like a pseudo-American flag. So what are the ways that we are elevating this particular narrative of American exceptionalism? Again, what are the stories that we tell? What are the examples that we give in our sermons? What are the books that we're studying? That's important, right? So one of the things I say is like, so for example, my son and I are huge movie fans. We go to watch movies all the time, and the big thing is to watch good actors. And good actors do something called method acting, which is they get so into a character that their impulses and reflexes come out of that embedded, embodied character, right? So De Niro, when he was filming Raging Bull, fought 10 professional fights, so that when they filmed him, he actually moved like a real boxer. He had embedded that emotional, physical experience into his body so that the reflexes came out that way. What we've taught, again, is the wrong reflexes. We've taught the wrong storyline. And how do you begin to change that storyline with other examples, with insight from other spaces that allows that existing narrative to be challenged?
Great. So I'm going to ask you two questions that you can respond to because I think they're related. So the first one is, do you think Asian American churches or the Asian American church in general, if there is such a thing, has anything distinctive to offer narratively? And then as a follow-up, since the 1965 Immigration Act, we seem to have been folded into white evangelicalism. How then to challenge it?
Wow, good question. Let me tackle the second one. During the time of apartheid, Japanese business people, most Japanese businessmen mostly, had trouble getting categorization from the South African government. They couldn't be categorized as white, but they didn't want to be black or colored or even Asian, because Asian was designated specific for South Asian merchant class. So these businessmen didn't really have a designation that gave them the rights they wanted coming in as investors into South Africa. So South African government created a special category. It was called honorary white people. And I wonder if that is our longing as an Asian American community. Willie Jennings says that salvific viability in the West is oftentimes tied in to approximation of whiteness. And Asian Americans can approximate whiteness better than most other communities. We can get into the Ivy League schools. We can get the engineering and medical and law jobs. And, again, that's a bit of a stereotype, and that's mostly focused in the East Asian community. But there are assumptions about the capacity, and there's gradations there as well, right? So East Asians can approximate whiteness better than Southeast Asian, or South Asian, there's colorism there, all of that. And so there are assumptions about how Asian Americans fit into majority culture, especially U.S. evangelicalism. And what's been sad is that we have often been co-opted without a unique voice because we fit so well. So several years ago, there was a cover story in Christianity Today. It said, Jonathan Edwards is my homeboy, and it was talking about the neo-reform movement, the new reform movement. And they showed a full picture of those who were at this conference, at least a third of those folks were Asian. Probably all Korean, to be honest with you. At least a third of those folks were Asian. And then they began to say, look how ethnically diverse we are. And so we become a part of that community in terms of the optics, but in terms of actual impact and change, there's very little of that. So in that sense, our identity has been co-opted, and because we have the capacity to operate as honorary white people, that gives us the space to do that. Now, again, what if we were to create new narratives and change the narrative and say, no, that's not our role in society? What was the first question? Sorry.
So is there anything unique that the Asian American Church can?
Yeah, and this is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a little bit stereotypical, but I talked about, Western society is hyper-individualistic. And there is, I don't want this to be too stereotypical, but there is a more communal element to Asian culture. The way I know this is I was at this gathering of clergy, and I don't know if you've seen this before, but it's a mixed gathering, and all the white folks kind of go off on their own for lunch, right? And they get together with 2 or 3 people, but they all kind of go off on their own. But there was a group of Asians in the corner, and we're in a circle. You know the circle, right? After a church, there's a circle of Asians who are trying to decide where to go eat. And it's a very communal experience, right? Everybody has a voice. Oh, I don't like that. You know that. You've seen it, right? The circle of Asians, while all the white folks have gone off to eat on their own, the circle of Asians that say, oh yeah, we got to figure this out as a community. We all have to agree on where we're going to go eat. And usually, like, lunchtime passes and nobody's eating because you're still in that little circle. That's an interesting way of looking at our communal, value system. And again, it's very interesting how in the Asian American community, and we all know when the ATO shootings occurred, there was a real deep sense of communal lament that came out from all over. And a lot of that was the Asian names that popped up. And, I lost my mom right around that time, and to see the Asian names and the ages of the women, that left a very deep, emotional, spiritual response to me. And I felt like, even in a negative way, I was part of a community because we had suffered this loss together. So there is a little more of that communal sense that I think we bring to what is largely a hyper-individualistic society in U.S. evangelicalism.
Great. Okay, so last question. Is there a way that we can explain what you talked about, systems and narratives, today with our children and our teens? Or what's the easiest way?
Well, I think that some of the stories are probably helpful. Think of it in more kind of illustrative ways. I tell a lot of kind of illustrations because that kind of transcends generational issues, right? So, the idea of like my son and I going to movies and watching a movie together and seeing these elements of the movie that speaks into real life. That's just a form of communication, learning good communication skills. And what you're talking about with how do you communicate to a child what they're really asking, right? The anxiety and fear. And I go back again to my daughter and I think I missed the boat on this one. I was like, Dad will come and get you. I think that was my response. But I think what my daughter really wanted to hear is not just that I would individually come and rescue her, and she's more aware of it now as a 22-year-old, but that I would do what it would take to make sure that those things aren't happening to her. Does that make sense? That that I would not just save her, and I would fly out here and take her out of here, but more that I would be a part of something that could change what the world looks like, rather than just me being a big, the big dad coming in and saving the child. So it differs, but I do wonder if my especially my daughter felt that of and it's just a really weird illustration on this. My daughter was doing a dance recital at Pepperdine, and it was a chance for me to meet all her friends. And one of the first things she did was, okay, Dad, these are my friends, and these are their pronouns. Please don't get those wrong. And now, Christian pastors, we don't do pronouns. That's secular evil culture. I said, no, this is my daughter. It's important to me. And she trusted me with this information. She trusted me as a dad to get that right. And so whatever my view on pronouns is, or all of that stuff. At the end of the day, my daughter was asking me to understand her world better and to not like say you're evil for using pronouns, but actually to say, you know what, these are your friends. And you're actually allowing me to be a part. I mean, what parent doesn't want that? To be invited into not just their kids' world, but their kids' friends' world. And so, I mean, sometimes I feel like what we're doing is we're saying, when situations like that occur, we're saying, you're evil for using pronouns, versus, I'm so glad you're allowing me to be a part of your life. And so maybe this is one of those spaces where we don't say, you're a Marxist for wanting gun control, versus let's actually do something that you feel like I'm on your side, and I'm with you on this.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask you, just to end this time, most of us, the majority of people in here are parents. You're a parent, you shared about your parenting journey. What would be a word of encouragement to us parents in the room, or to yourself, about engaging with our children about gun violence protection?
Yeah, there's never a moment where I've regretted having either the tough conversations or difficult conversations with my kids. There are moments that I've regretted, why didn't I have those conversations? Why didn't we talk about those things? Again, my 22 and 19, they're not really kids anymore. Although adolescence keeps getting pushed further and further out, so yeah, they're still adolescents. But I can't think of any moment where I regretted hearing what their pain was, or hearing what their... I'll say this, maybe I'm getting a little too personal. My son really struggles with depression and anxiety, which is that's a pandemic right now among teenagers. Depression and anxiety is just a profound impact in our communities. And I would say Asian Americans have, I don't know if it's higher rates, but it's certainly noticeable. With depression and anxiety. And I feel helpless because I don't want my son to feel that way. I want him to be confident, and but that's, again, I don't think I ever regret the time and the energy of just being able to hear him out. And I don't ever regret him saying that to me, although he says it in some obnoxious ways. The fact that I can't go back and say that was wasted time. Yeah, I think that's something to hear that, and hear them in the way that they need to be heard. Like I said, my daughter doesn't need me to go on a rant about, but male and female, God created them. No, she doesn't need that. Maybe another story. My daughter's roommate, she's, I don't even know what the term is, but gender ambiguous. I remember my daughter saying to me, because I love Hannah. She's wonderful, wonderful, dear girl. I said it. I actually used the wrong pronouns there. But I remember, Dad, when you first met her, and then when she began to kind of question her sexuality and her gender, all that, and she had come out to my daughter, and my daughter told me about it, that when you saw her again, you gave her a hug, and that was something huge for her. She's actually biracial. Her dad's Asian, her mom's white. And from my understanding is that her Asian dad rejected her pretty profoundly as a result of this. And so that when you gave her a hug, that was very significant. And again, I'm like, I go into these evangelical circles and well, you did what's wrong. Why didn't you point out the sin of that person's life? And I was like, F you. It's like, no. My daughter's friend is hurting because someone that looks like me hurt her, and my daughter is asking me to be a part of her life. Why would I ever walk away from that? And I think on this issue of gun control, our children are literally asking us to do something about this. So when my daughter tells me, I have not felt safe since I was 8 years old in a public setting, that's, as a dad, I'm saying, wait, I got to hear that. I got to listen to that. And I might feel safe. I might have, security and all that stuff. But my teenage daughter didn't feel that. And my son, same way, depression, anxiety. He's heightened around big gatherings. And so if our kids are speaking to us, we should not only listen, but say, okay, what's our response as parents? And it could be individual, loving our child, but it also needs to be structural and narrative.
Great. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
If you would please thank Dr. Ra with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.